That was Cena with Next Generation. You're on 94.9. It's 13 minutes past 4. And it's Tuesday. Yes, Tuesday afternoon. Time for Creation Ministries International. And good news today. We have our very special guest from New Zealand, Mr. Mark James. Good afternoon, Mark James.
Good afternoon, Mick, and to all the listeners as well.
And it's always awesome having you, from way over there in New Zealand across the ditch. How was your Easter?
I had a wonderful time, to be honest, Mick. It was really great. Not doing an awful lot, stayed at home, did a bit of gardening, but also just it's a blessed time for the church, and I thoroughly enjoyed the whole weekend.
Yes, awesome. I know there was many of us that did, and a lot of people just love that sort of extra time off. I only assume it's the same in New Zealand. You end up with 4 days off in a row?
Yeah, we do, and then we've got a 3-day working week, and then it's Anzac Day, so a couple of short weekends, weeks in a row.
Yes, we're pretty excited about that as well. 3 days this week. How cool is that? Except, of course, there are some people that work in shops and service stations and that sort of thing that do have to work. Good on you guys if you do. Now, Mark James, so much to talk about. Of course, creation, evolution, dinosaurs, aliens. You guys have answers to all sorts of questions. And if anybody has any particular questions for Mark James, please send them through to our text line. Just SMS 0401 949 949. Now, Mark, today we're going to have a bit of a chat about, I guess, when we sit down and talk to people, and over time they ask us all sorts of interesting questions. And you're going to talk about double standards in the creation-evolution debate.
Yeah, and Mick, I have a brother who is an anti-theist. He's an absolute atheist. And fascinating thing happened last week. I sent him an article from our website with a comment saying, if you think evolution can produce everything we see around us, you should read this article. Yeah. And he came back to me and he said, you know what? He said, I don't believe that evolution can produce everything. And it started this conversation with him, and he's decided that intelligent design is the most logical explanation for what we see around us. Now,
how cool is that?
It's amazing, actually. This is a brother who usually when I bring up these topics says, I'm not interested. I don't care. I'm not interested in talking about it. Uh-huh. But as we were discussing it, and we're talking about this intelligent designer, and he says, I can't be a very good intelligent designer because of all the bad stuff. And I said, what sort of bad stuff are you talking about? And he said, what about that worm that burrows into the eyes of children in Africa? And this is it's a David Attenborough quote, to be honest. David Attenborough uses this as an explanation for why he doesn't believe in God. People say, oh, God does all these wonderful things, and David Attenborough says, yeah, but what about this worm that can only survive by living in the eye of these children in Africa? Mm. And when you're first presented with something like that, it can be quite confronting.
Yep.
Because coming from someone like David Attenborough, you assume it's got this wealth of scientific sort of support behind it. But it is a fact that this worm can only survive by living in the eye of children or people. And so when it's first presented, and this is what happens, you're talking to people about Jesus, they'll present something like this. And if it's new to science, it can be very confronting. And people can start to doubt their faith because of it. What I say in that situation, and there are so many examples like this, but if it's new to science, then it's going to take a little bit of time for our creation scientists to examine the evidence, to examine the facts, and new facts that come to light along the way, and then come up with a biblical creationist understanding of the facts that we see. And this eyeworm is a very good example.
Sounds gruesome.
It is gruesome. Mm. But what you've got to realize is that people like Attenborough, they don't believe that the fall is something that has happened in history. Mm-hmm. So they're assuming that God must have created this worm that bores through people's eyes. But of course, from a biblical perspective, we know that God created everything perfect. It was all very good.
Yep.
So this worm is a result of mutations and the degradation since the fall. And now we know, having examined how this happens, is that it is actually a mutational issue. It is something that is it's a worm that, in fact, it's not even the worm that lives in the eye. So, the more we find out about it, the less support there is for the fact that this worm can only live in the eye in the eyeball.
Yeah.
So what I say to people, I suppose, is when these things come up, when this new science is, and you know what, new discoveries in science, they're part of the joy of science. And as a biblical creationist, all this new information that's coming to light, it's a joy to actually see it coming to light. Mm. But I always temper that with wait until the creation scientists, the people at creation.com, the Creation Ministries, have had a look at the facts, and quite often, and in fact, in virtually all situations, when we finally have all the facts, it becomes obvious that it isn't support for evolution at all, that it is actually better explained from a biblical perspective.
Yeah, more and more we see that.
Oh, yeah. And our batting average is incredibly good. I mean, in the past, there's been things like gill slits in human embryos. This was, in fact, I was speaking to somebody recently who threw that one at me, gill slits in human embryos. And when I said, actually, there are no gill slits in human embryos, this lady said, but I saw it on TV a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
So these things are still being used as ammunition against for evolution and against the biblical understanding. The poor design of the human eye. Richard Dawkins has used this one a lot. Poor design of the human eye. He claims that the eye of an octopus is better designed than the eye of a human. And we now know, because people have done research into it, that there are very special cells in the human eye called Mueller glial cells, which just solve this problem from a biblical creation perspective, and make Dawkins' argument that the eye is poorly designed completely wrong.
Yep.
Junk DNA is another one. You know, for years we were told that only 2% of DNA codes for proteins, so the rest must be junk. And this junk is exactly what we would expect to find if evolution were true. Now we know that virtually all of the DNA is transcribed and is all doing something, so there is no junk DNA. Yeah. And I suppose the double standard is that when these evidences for evolution are found to be nothing of the sort, the scientists just drop them. They don't want to talk about them anymore. There's no apology. There's no, we got it wrong. They just push it aside and they wait for the next piece of science to come along that they can use to beat up on creationists. And that's where I believe the double standard is. That, if we were to say, it's okay, creationists will eventually work this out, we get accused of using the God of the gaps argument. But scientists, these evolutionists, all the time say, it's something that they can't explain. Scientists will eventually work it out. And that's, I think, where this huge double standard is.
You mentioned just before gill slits. What are they?
Gill slits. In embryos, there is this little fold in human embryos and in other embryos of other creatures as well. At a certain stage of development, there are these little folds. When they were first discovered, the idea was put forward that as the embryo goes through its development, it goes through all these different phases of evolution, and these gill slits in human embryos are harking back to when human beings evolved from fish.
Oh, right. So gills as in the way you breathe underwater.
Exactly.
Uh-huh.
Now, when you first look at them, they look like gill slits, but we know that they're not gill slits. they're actually just folds that become the chin. I think it is basically. They're just folds. They're nothing to do with breathing at all. But it was used as evidence for evolution because it's they said, that as the embryo develops, it goes through the stages of evolution. It is completely wrong, but this was used as evidence for that and evidence for evolution. And I'm sure an awful lot of people back then were convinced that evolution was true because of this gill slit, or these gill slits, which we now know, because people have examined them and we have all the facts, are nothing to do with evolution at all.
Wow. I mean, more and more we see science coming out and proving pretty much what's written in the Bible is correct. And quite often, these theories come up because, they didn't have good enough microscopes or whatever it might have been back then. And then all of a sudden they come out with the truth. And it's like, now it lines up with the Bible. But, we don't see them retracting the previous information or stories that they threw our way, which is quite interesting, isn't it? It sort of shows that there's a bit of there's a number of people or powers out there trying to rubbish Christianity and what we believe in.
Absolutely. Yeah, now, I would say that a lot of scientists who talk about these things, it's outside their area of expertise. They've heard it from other scientists, and they're just sharing it, okay? But if you go back to the scientists that are actually doing the experimenting and doing the work, those scientists are the ones that should be saying, actually, we were wrong. It's something that you very rarely hear from the scientific community.
Yeah. I mean, we spoke to Dr. John once, and he was telling us about some of the textbooks used in schools. And some of the information used in the textbooks was outdated years ago, but they just haven't got around to changing it yet. So they still teach it. Yeah.
And the interesting thing is, on our website, we actually have a whole section of arguments that creationists shouldn't use. And the reason we have that is because the scientific evidence, scientific facts, we're always building on what we've known before. And some of these evidences that we use as in support of the biblical account have found to be no such thing. And what we will do is we'll say, right, guys, as creationists, we should not be using that argument because it has now been proved to be wrong.
Yep.
And we have this section on our website called Arguments We Think Creationists Should Not Use.
Yeah.
But it's when the boot's on the other foot, when we find that there are facts that actually say that the evolutionary interpretation is wrong, I don't know if there's any websites anywhere, arguments that evolutionists shouldn't use. Yeah. Basically, they just say, oh, yeah, okay, so that one's gone. But we've got more arguments that we're bringing up all the time. And as they bring these new arguments up, creation scientists will look at them, they will show them to be wrong, and our batting average is very, very good in this regard. But the evolutionists will just say, oh, yeah, okay, so we'll push that one aside, and we'll bring up some more arguments.
All right, we are with Mark James from New Zealand. If you have any questions for him, please send them through to our text line, 0401 949 949. We're going to jump into a bit of music right now. Stephen Stanley, Rest in the Faith, and we'll be back with Mark James after the break. And that was Terry Ann with Nobody. You're on 94.9. It's 23 minutes to 5, and we have Mark James on the line from New Zealand, who in the last half hour did mention that he kind of got through to his, atheist brother in the last week. That's intriguing, Mark.
It certainly is, Mick. And what I would say is to anybody out there who's praying for and talking to friends, family, workmates, persistence. I think I've been talking to my brother probably for 10, 15 years about this particular topic, and his answer in the past has always been, don't come to me and talk to me about that sort of stuff. I'm not interested.
Yep.
So to have him tell me a week or so ago that he's decided that evolution couldn't possibly explain everything we see around us, I honestly, when I read the email that he sent me, I just about fell off my chair, to be honest. But the questions he's been asking have actually highlighted to me, and I've known that the biblical creation message is important.
Yep.
But it's highlighted to me just how important it is. Because as I've been going through this conversation with my brother, he's been throwing up these bad things, like this eye worm. He also has thrown up, so that's natural evil, the bad things that we see in nature.
Yep.
And he's also thrown up the human evil. So the war in Ukraine and what's going on in Palestine, and these sorts of things he's throwing at me. And this is the why would a good God allow all these death and suffering in the world? And it's one of the major questions that we get asked.
We do all the time. Yep.
Yeah. We talk about God being a good God, that He created this wonderful creation, and we can see it in all the amazing things in creation. But then people throw back. There's a lot of bad stuff out there, and we have to admit that there is a lot of bad stuff. Yeah. And the only logical answer, the only way we can answer that question, is through a biblical creationist understanding of Genesis, because God created everything, and at the end of the creation week, He created everything in 6 ordinary earth days. At the end of the 6th day, He saw everything that He had created, and He declared it to be very good.
Yes.
So everything was created perfect. There was no disease, there was no death, there was no suffering. But then Adam rebelled. The first man sinned and rebelled against God, and that is why there are so many bad things today, because creation was cursed because of Adam's rebellion. And God gave him He said you can eat of any tree in the garden. There was one tree that you can't eat from, and Adam decided he was going to eat from that tree, and that's the fall. Now, as soon as you have that God created the perfect creation and that it was man that's caused all the problems, you then have an answer to this question of why there is death and suffering and all these bad things in the world today. And only Christianity has an answer to that question of a good God with all the bad things we see today. But it's only biblical Christianity that has the correct answer. And I would say to any listeners out there who are trying to fit evolution into the Bible, then you take away the defense of our God. You effectively are calling into question the very nature of God. Because if evolution is true, then God used evolution to get us to where we are today, then God used disease, suffering, and death. Evolution it's a process of death. Death is what makes evolution progress effectively. Things have to die. If God used evolution, then He introduced death and suffering into this world. And so you then do not have an answer to how a good God could allow disease, death, and suffering. And it's the same with the long ages, because people say, oh, yeah, but I don't believe in evolution, but I do believe that the Earth is billions of years old. But the idea that the Earth is billions of years old comes from the rocks and the fossils. Fossils are dead things, which means that in those rocks, which have been there for billions of years before man, there is all this evidence of death and suffering, the carnivory. We see bones that have tooth marks on them. We see bones that have evidence for cancer. All of these things are in the rock record. And if that rock record came before Adam, then we have disease, suffering, and death before the fall. And again, we have a God who's used all this bad stuff to bring us to where we are today. And we don't have an answer to that question of how can we say that our God is good if he's used all this evolution and for millions of years to get us where we are today.
Mark, we do have people that obviously have tuned in that may have gone to a church or may still go to a church where they teach some of this. Evolution is sort of, I guess, partially taught. And, some people will have this question, well, does this mean I'm not going to heaven?
Okay, and that's a really good point, Mick. I am not saying that if you believe in evolution of millions of years, then you are not a Christian. We are saved by grace through faith. And I like to say to people, you could get everything in the Bible wrong, but if you get Jesus right, then you are saved. So, yeah, and we get accused of this all the time by some of the people, that, Christians who believe in evolution of millions of years. And they say, are you telling me that I'm not a Christian? No, we're not telling people that they're not Christian, because we are saved by grace through faith. It's not works, saved by grace through faith.
Yep.
But when you come to share your faith with unbelievers, they are going to ask questions. And that one big question that you will get asked is, how can a good God allow all these bad things?
Yeah.
And if you're going to do what the Bible says you need to do, which is share your faith, what is it? It's the Great Commission.
Yep.
We are called to share our faith with unbelievers.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're doing that, you're going to get asked these questions, and you need to have an answer to that particular question in particular.
Yeah, I remember when I was teaching Scripture, and the kids said to me, well, why is there pain and suffering in the world? It's a very similar sort of question.
Yeah, and the only Bible-affirming and God, the Creator God of the universe, the Christian God, the only explanation that makes sense is that everything was created perfect, and because of our sin, these things like disease, suffering, and death have entered into the world.
Yes, absolutely.
And Mick, I told you before, I come from an atheist background. I became a Christian, and when I first became a Christian, I still believed in evolution and millions of years, and I tried to fit them into the Bible. And it was only because, in fact, it was my youngest son actually came to find me one day, and he had the neighbor's boy in tow with him.
Uh-huh.
And my 9-year-old son had been over at the next door neighbor's house, and he was sharing the gospel with the next door neighbor's the mother.
Yeah.
And the son. He was sharing the gospel, and the mother said to him, I don't believe in God or any of that stuff because too many bad things happen in this world.
Wow.
So my son had brought the next door neighbor's boy to me to answer that question for him. And at that stage, I believed in evolution. I knew what the Bible said. I knew, everything was created in 6 days. It was created perfect, and it's only because of man's rebellion that there's death and suffering. But I believed in evolution, and because of that, I couldn't answer that question that my son had thrown at him.
Wow.
And it was at that point that I realized that I had some work to do. I had to resolve this issue.
Yes.
That's when I started looking into the science, and you know what? I've come out the other end as an absolute biblical creationist because the scientific facts, when interpreted through correctly, I have found always support the biblical account.
Yeah, and the more you look, the more you realize it does. Yes.
Yeah,
well,
and you know what? My son still has a wonderful faith, but I always think, the next door neighbor's boy, I don't know where he is now. They moved away. I had an opportunity to speak truth into his life, and I missed it because I didn't believe the biblical account.
Wow. Yeah, that's a hard reality.
Yeah, absolutely.
By the same token, you're now speaking truth to so many other people. Mark James, thank you so much for this afternoon. It's always awesome having you on, and I'm thinking maybe we've got you again next week.
You have, definitely. I'm looking
Excellent.
forward to it already.
So am I. Next Tuesday, that will be absolutely awesome. Well, thank you, Mark James from New Zealand. Hey, if anybody does have any questions for Mark James next week, please send them through to our text line. Just text through to 0401 949 949. You are on 94.9. It's 12 minutes to 5, and we've got Cade Thompson up next with Grateful.